So the Spline IK is often a very confusing setup for some people, just because it includes an IK handle, externalized controls, and a NURBS curve, which essentially runs through the spine, which actually controls the deformation. Essentially, the setup is fairly simple, but because it's so simple, it's pretty easy to make a few mistakes and cause some problems for yourself. So essentially, the way the setup works is that it allows you to basically rotate your controls and deform the spine, but it also allows you to select your control curves and translate them to influence the deformation of the spine as well. Okay, so it's a very simple setup. It offers you a good amount of deformation. And one more thing, this version of the setup has is it also allows for a natural twist of the spine. Okay, which is actually also pretty easy to set up. So usually you're going to start with, of course, your spine, and let's say a cog control or a root control for your character. So I'm just going to come in and delete everything else that makes the setup work. Okay, and last but not least. Okay, so we have our joint structure, and we're going to need a few controls for it. So first we're going to look at the spine. Now usually when you're going to set up a spline IK setup, you're going to basically have to know how many joints you have in your spine, because you're essentially going to have to create a control for each one that you want to basically manipulate with your setup. So in this case I have 4 and 5. 5 being the topmost point. Usually I don't go into the neck. I'll usually stop the control for the spine, usually just below the clavicle or at the clavicle, because usually you want to control the neck using a separate control, or in some cases I'll actually use a control that's essentially directly connected or directly related to the head control. So I usually stop all spline IK at around the clavicle level, or all spine control. And I usually start from just above the root, basically the base of the spine. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to create a curve, which basically is snapped to each one of the joints in the spine. Now, by default, what you can do, or what the IK Spline handle tool is, which is located in your skeleton menu, you go to the option box. By default, this tool wants to create the curve for you. It also wants to automatically parent that curve in to essentially follow the joint structure. But those are a couple of things that we don't want to happen. And you want to disable the auto parent option, and then disable the auto create curve option. Now another thing I actually set here is I usually activate root twist mode, and I set the twist type so that it's in and out. So ease in and out, so that's actually hopefully going to be more animation friendly. Now since we've set the Spline IK handle tool to not create the curve, we need to create the curve manually. So in order to do that, you need to go to the create menu, CV curve tool option box, and set your CV curve tool's curve degree so that it's linear, and this so that it's not trying to create a smooth curve, it's just trying to create the CVs and essentially the lines between them. Because we don't need anything to be super smooth here, we just need the CVs to be exactly where we want them to be. Okay, so once you have that tool selected and the curve degree is set for linear, what you want to do then is you actually want to start snapping to the joints in the spine. And so I'm going to go from the base of the spine up to the clavicle. And so pressing the snap to point, so that's this button here, going to that's that button, snap to point. Okay, you can also press V is in vet on the keyboard, and you can manually snap to point. As I press it, you can see it blinking if you look at the top of the interface. So if you press and hold it, whenever you left click, it'll snap to the joints, because the joints are essentially points. Regardless of what you actually see that represents the joint is a single point within Maya's workspace. And so once you press enter, it completes that curve. While you have that curve selected, usually a good idea to come in and name it. Name everything you create, and I'm going to call this my curve, and we'll call it spine. Okay, so if I go to my outliner, I can actually see that little curve. Now we're ready to go to our IK Spline handle tool. Option should be set. Remember, do not auto parent and do not create curve. Just tell it to create the spline. And to do that, what you're going to do is you're going to click at the base of your spine and then to the lowest point, which in this case is going to be clavicle, and then the last thing you're going to left click on is going to be the curve itself. As soon as you do that, it creates the connection between the IK and the curve. So now if I temporarily disable my ability to select the joints, and I come in and I right click on the CV, on the control curve, and activate CVs, you can see that each one of the control, the CVs, is specifically centered on the joints. Okay, and I'm also going to temporarily disable handle selection, or you can go to show and disable IK handle so you can't see it, because it can get in the way sometimes when you're trying to make selections. So for now, you can just turn off his visibility temporarily. So now if you actually grab those points and you move them, you can see that they're actually controlling your spine. Okay? And notice when you're moving the CVs that it's only affecting the joint that's specifically linked to it. Okay, the other joints are pretty much anchored where they are, of course, relative to the displacement created by the curve. So now we need to actually create some externalized controls that we can actually keyframe and select easily to manipulate that spine. And so once again, I turn to the CV curve tool. So I go to create CV curve tool, and I'll usually leave it on linear so I can snap to the grid so that I can make something very specific. So if I'm not quite sure what I'm making, I might make just a box using a certain number of grid points. Press enter, and then I can come in and I can manipulate the CVs easily to reshape it into whatever kind of control shape I want. Okay, so let's say this little star is going to be good, and I'll scale it down a bit, and I'll rename it, and we'll call this my SP control, spine control. Okay, so now what you want to do is you actually want to create one of these controls for each joint. And so what I usually do is I will take my joints and I'll put them into sort of a restricted mode. This way I can select things around them, and I can even snap to them without them interfering with selections. You don't have to do that. You can still snap to them regardless. And then I'll select my control curve and I'll do a snap to point and bring it up so that it aligns with my first or my base joint. Then I will usually Control D or Command D, depending on whether you're on Mac or Windows, and make another curve and then snap that one to the next joint. And I'll just repeat that process until I have a control for each joint. Okay, so now I have 5 controls. But we don't want our controls to be seated inside of the geometry. We want our controls to be externalized, which is why we're creating the Spline IK controls anyway, or part of it. We want our controls to be accessible. So I'm going to take these, and while still maintaining the relative alignment, I'm just going to translate them directly back in the z-axis, maintaining the same height and x position. So they are now directly behind the joints that they control. And then if I want to make them a little more visible, I could rotate them around 90 degrees in the Z so that now they're actually facing the camera. So they're a little easier to see this way. And then maybe I'll scale them down a little bit so they don't overlap so much. Or what I could do is I could scale them down a little bit and then maybe rotate them so that they don't overlap so much. It just depends on how you want to do it. I'm just going to scale them down. Okay, so once they're scaled down, I'm going to modify freeze transformations, and I'll freeze, we'll just say let's freeze everything for now. Okay, so once you have your control curves in place, usually you want to go through and of course name them, although if you name them ahead of time, they should have names that are relatively good enough for their positions. And so now we need to make them aware of each other within the hierarchy. They basically need to form a hierarchy. But even before we do that, we're going to take the pivot point of each one of these controls and we want it to align perfectly with the joint. So selecting the curve, you want to toggle your pivot point. You can toggle your pivot point either by pressing and holding the letter D, D as in dog, on the keyboard, and then you can just left click and drag on the manipulator to align it with your joint, or you can do a snap to point. While that manipulator is active too, you can now press and hold V at the same time that D is active, and then you can snap your pivot point to the joint in your spine. Make sure you don't have the geometry activated. If you have it templated, that's fine, but if it's activated in any other way, your pivot point may accidentally snap to it. So make sure that your geometry is not interrupting your snapping. And so go through each control and snap its pivot point to the joint that it's supposed to control. Okay, so once you're done with that, then we're ready for the next step in the setup. We need to make sure that each one of the controls is going to stay aligned relative to the control below it. And in order to do that, we need to have it mimic the hierarchy that we see with the joints. Now, the joints are actually parented together. The bones in between actually do nothing except indicate that there's a connection between the joints. But since our curves are not joints, they're not going to give us that sort of indication. But they will, like the joints, if you select the base of the joint structure, you'll see that each one of the joints above it highlights to show that it's being influenced by that joint at the base of the hierarchy. So if I went to the joint, let's say spine joint number 3 here, or 2, notice how it doesn't affect the joint below it, but you can see that the joints above it highlight because they are part of its hierarchy. And that's sort of the kind of behavior we want to create with curves. So starting at the top, we'll take this curve, shift select the curve below it, and press P on the keyboard to parent it to that curve. So now when we select that second curve, the one above it highlights because it's now part of essentially spine curve control 3's hierarchy. And then I'm going to take spline control 3, shift select spline control 2, and press P again. And then 2, I'm going to select spline control 1, press P again, select spline control 1, and select the spline control base, and P again. So now each one of my control curves is in a single hierarchy. If you look at your outliner, when you expand, you'll actually see sort of a step pattern, which shows a connection basically taking steps up to the next control curve. If all of your control curves are in a single line, your hierarchy is incorrect, so fix it. Okay, and so this is the kind of step setup that you want to maintain with those controls. Next, we want to actually take these controls and anchor them to either to our root or to our joint structure. I tend to prefer anchoring them to the joint structure itself. And so I'll take essentially the parent curve in the hierarchy, which is the one at the very bottom, and I'll create a group around it. and then I'll snap its pivot point to my root control. I'm going to name that group, and we'll call this group my spine curve group. Okay, and then I'll take that group and I will take my root joint or my cog joint, whatever you want to call it. So let me expand. I'll take my root joint and then I'll control select or command select the group around my spine controls, and I'll parent constrain them so that now those controls should stay aligned with my root. So if I move my root, you can see the controls are trying to follow it. Notice the spine doesn't follow yet because we actually haven't hooked our controls in to influence the curve that's currently controlling it. And that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so now we have all of our controls in place. All of my spine controls have 0 translation, 0 rotation, and 0 scale, which is exactly what we want. So now we need to, once again, make sure that our joints aren't going to interfere with selection. So you can either go to show and tell it not to show the joints temporarily, or you can set up a layer, channels layer, and then just hide them temporarily. And so now we have the curve that's controlling our spine. So if you right click on it and choose CV or control vertex, you'll see your CVs that are actually controlling the joint structure for the spine. And so now we need to actually take each one of these CVs and we need to connect them to our control curves. In order to do that, we need to essentially create a cluster to control the individual CVs. So select each CV, go to create deformers and cluster. And I usually start from the bottom because it names and numbers them in order, although I'm probably going to rename them anyway. But you don't necessarily have to. So select each CV and create cluster, and just repeat that process and you have them all generated. Now one quick way to keep creating clusters without having to toggle back and forth is to switch yourself to component mode so that the CVs are just active, and then you can just select them and then just do a G to repeat last command. Okay, so now I have a cluster, and then once you're done you switch back to object mode, and now I have a cluster for each CV. This way I don't have to actually switch myself into component mode to manipulate the curve. And so now I need to take each one of these and need to connect it to my control. So you can connect them in 2 different ways. So you can either parent each cluster to its control curve. Simply select the cluster handle in your outliner, which is going to be the easiest way to select it, and then shift select the control curve that corresponds to it relative to the joint structure, and then press P. And essentially it will parent it under that control curve. Fairly simple. Now another option is you could actually use constraints to make that same thing happen. If you want to do a constraint, you can. You need to select the curve first, of course, and then control or command select your cluster handle from the outliner, or you can just shift select it within the workspace and do a constraint. You can do a parent, or actually a point would be fine, because if you parent it, it'll constrain the rotation as well, which is sort of ineffectual in this case, since the CV is actually a single point, so rotating it wouldn't actually have any influence. Okay, so now that we have all of our control curves and our clusters are anchored to our control curves, if you select all of your control curves and just try to rotate them, you'll see that you get a nice FK rotation on your spine. Okay, and if you do the same thing for left to right, notice we get a nice rotation. Okay, so that is the main part of the setup, but there's a little more, because if you actually do a twist, notice how we actually don't have a spine twist. Okay, so let's take care of that. So now we need to see our IK handle. Okay, so if you select your IK handle and you go to its channels box, you'll actually see an attribute called twist. Okay, so now if we actually scrub this value, notice we'll actually get sort of a natural spine twist. Now we're getting a natural spine twist partially because of the settings that we set up initially. And so we want to be able to control this spine twist from our controls. So there's only one attribute to link into, so what I usually do is I'll link it to the one that actually rotates the most, which is essentially going to be the end of the spline or the IK spline chain, which in this case is going to be our clavicle. Okay, so I'm going to select that control, and the rotation, the value, the attribute that's going to correspond to the direction of the twist needs to rotate in is of course the y-axis. I'm going to shift select the IK handle, go to Window, General Editors, Connection Editor, and if your connection editor is set up with default settings, you should have your control and its outputs on the left side and the IK handle on the right. Now don't forget to go back and rename your IK handle later. You should label everything specific to what its purpose is. We want to expand the rotation, click on the rotate Y, and then left click on the twist value to make the connection. And pretty much that's it. Connection made. If I select the IK handle, you'll see that the twist now has its attribute value highlighted in yellow, indicating an incoming connection. While I'm here, I'll just relabel this, and I'll say IK spine. Okay. And so now if I select my control handle for the clavicle, and I twist it, now we have a natural spine twist. Now, even though that one control actually does manipulate rotation, the others do not. So we're going to select those controls, and we're going to disable the rotate Y for all of those. But we're also going to disable the scale and the visibility. Okay, so I'm going to select all 4 of those controls, not the top one, just the 4 below. And I'm going to select rotate Y, and then I'm going to control or command select scale and visibility on their name, right click and hold, and choose to lock and hide those attributes. And then with the control at the top, it's rotate X and it's rotate Z do absolutely nothing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this rotate X and its rotate Z and its scale and visibility, and lock and hide those, leaving the translates and the rotate Y for that top control, and for the bottom controls I leave the translates, the rotate X, and the rotate Z. So the rotate Y is only on the top control, and the rotate Y and Z is not present on the top control at all. So now we can double check. Now I have my cog control, which controls where the rig goes. Now if I actually translate this, my spine should follow. If your spine is not following, your controls aren't staying aligned, or there's some sort of double transformation going on, you know that you did something wrong. But in my case, it looks like I did everything just right. And so we can once again check our controls. Now as is, we have our rotation from left to right and front to back, no problem. But we also have our translation, so I can translate to affect the joints as well as rotate the individual segments. And of course we have our natural spine twist from the top. Okay, so that's pretty much it for setting up an IK spline setup. Beyond that, it's all about going through and doing cleanup, and make sure that you do not break the control by manipulating or disrupting the hierarchy.